The rain had soaked the battlefield for hours, turning the earth into a thick, sucking mud. Thunder rolled in the distance, mingling with the sharp cracks of artillery that still echoed through the ruined village. Private James Callahan pressed, himself against the shattered wall of a bombed-out farmhouse, breath ragged, eyes scanning the smoke-choked horizon. Around him, the world seemed to exist only in flashes, flames leaping from collapsed roofs, men screaming, and the stench of gunpowder thick in the air. But amid the chaos, a single thought anchored him. He had to move, and he had to survive. James wasn't like the others. He was young, yes, barely 21, but he had a mind for tactics and an instinct for danger that most seasoned soldiers envied. Intelligence had come through just hours earlier, a high-ranking enemy officer. The one orchestrating ambush that had decimated entire Allied units would be in the village tonight. The generals deemed him untouchable, a ghost among shadows. Yet here James was, tasked with a mission everyone else called impossible. Infiltrate the village, locate the officer, and, if fate allowed, capture him. He shifted, testing the weight of his rifle, listening to the distant crunch of enemy boots over broken cobblestones. Every step was a risk, every breath a gamble. His heart thumped not from fear alone, but from the raw awareness of what was at stake. If he failed, hundreds of lives, perhaps thousands, would be lost in the coming attacks. And yet the thought of succeeding, of turning the tide with a single, precise strike burned within him like fire. Through the haze he caught a glimpse of movement. Shadows danced between crumbling buildings, and a patrol of enemy soldiers emerged, rifles cutting through the night. James froze, barely daring to breathe as the men passed mere meters away. Time seemed to stretch. A heartbeat could mean life. Or death, then, as if sensing his presence, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and blood. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows, calculating the route he would take once the patrol moved on. Every detail mattered, every misstep could spell doom, and yet, despite the danger, a strange calm settled over him. This was what he had trained for, what every late night in the barracks had prepared him for. The impossible didn't intimidate him, it defined him. With a silent nod to himself, James adjusted his pack, checked the safety on his rifle, and stepped into the night, disappearing into the smoke and ruin. The mission had begun. Somewhere in the darkened village, the enemy officer waited, unaware that a single soldier had already begun weaving a plan that could change the course of the battle. The rain fell harder now, hammering the rooftops, masking the sounds of James's movement. And as he vanished into the shadows, one truth hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder. Tonight, the impossible might just become reality. The village stretched before James like a living trap. Broken streets twisted under the shadow of half-collapsed buildings, and every corner seemed to whisper warnings he could almost hear. Rain-slicked cobblestones reflected flickers of enemy searchlights, and the occasional flare cut through the fog, revealing the patrols that stalked the streets like predators. He moved low, keeping to the edges, every sense straining. One wrong step, one careless sound, and the mission would end before it began. He paused in a narrow alley, listening. The wind carried faint voices, German commands, clipped and sharp, punctuated by the distant bang of rifles. His eyes caught the glint of a bayonet in the dim light. Patrols crisscrossed the streets with methodical precision, moving like chess pieces, unaware that a single piece him was about to disrupt their strategy. James's mind raced, calculating every path, every possible hiding spot. His breathing slowed as he reminded himself, patience would be as lethal as courage tonight. Then came a sound that made him freeze, a soft, deliberate whistle. He pressed himself against the wall, heartbeat hammering, scanning the shadowy corners. A figure emerged from the darkness, a local resistance fighter, a wiry man no older than James, with eyes sharp as knives. "You're far from home, American," the man whispered, his accent thick but precise. James nodded, gesturing to follow. Together, they slipped through the maze of alleys, the resistance fighter pointing out safe passages and hidden dangers. "This way," the man hissed. "But the officer, he's not just any soldier. He's clever, predicts movements, sets, traps. Last 2 squads vanished where you plan to go. James's stomach tightened. Clever, deadly, that word had echoed through intelligence reports. In whispered tones, a specter haunting the mission's edges. He swallowed hard, pressing forward. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated. They crossed the remnants of a bombed-out square, the skeletal frames of buildings looming like silent witnesses. A sudden crack of gunfire sent them both to the ground, mud splattering their uniforms. A German patrol had discovered a nearby hideout, their torches casting sharp, searching beams over the debris. James held his breath, counting heartbeats, willing them to pass. The patrol moved on, but the tension lingered, wrapping around him like a second skin. Almost there, the resistance fighter whispered, nodding toward a narrow canal cutting through the village. From here, it's your call. James nodded, glancing at the waterlogged streets. The canal offered cover, but was treacherous, slippery planks and sudden drops into icy water. One misstep could mean exposure or worse, a fracture that would leave him helpless in enemy territory. He hesitated, then steeled himself. The mission was no longer about heroics, it was about survival and precision. With careful steps, he navigated the planks, feeling the water rise to his boots. Shadows moved along the edges of the canal, and James held still, listening to the rhythmic patter of rain masking distant voices. Hours felt like minutes as he moved. The resistance fighter had vanished into the darkness, leaving James alone to face the final stretch toward the enemy officer's location. Every instinct screamed caution, yet he knew hesitation could be deadly. He thought of the soldiers whose lives depended on the success of this mission, and a cold determination replaced a creeping fear. Suddenly, movement caught his eye, a flicker of a uniform through a broken doorway. He ducked behind a ruined wall, heart pounding, watching the enemy soldier pause and light a cigarette. The soft glow illuminated his face just long enough for James to memorize details, a face that would soon become crucial to identifying the officer's patterns. He exhaled silently, letting his training guide him. Patience, observation, then action. Minutes stretched, each one a test of nerve. A stray cat scurried across the alley, sending up a cloud of dust and triggering a sharp whistle from a distant guard. James froze, muscles rigid. The officer or his men could be anywhere, always one step ahead. His pulse thrummed in his ears as he inched forward, tracing the officer's likely path from intelligence reports and careful observation. By midnight, the village had become a landscape of shadows and whispers. James crouched atop a collapsed wall, scanning for the officer's residence. Smoke drifted from chimneys, carrying the faint scent of burned fuel and stale bread. Ordinary life continuing under extraordinary circumstances. Somewhere within, the officer plodded, unaware that a single soldier had penetrated defenses everyone deemed impenetrable. And yet doubt gnawed at him. What if the patrols increased? What if the officer anticipated him? Every logical thought had been weighed. Every scenario imagined, but uncertainty was a constant companion. He paused, closing his eyes briefly, listening to the night, letting focus replace fear. This was more than strategy. It was instinct, honed over months of training and battlefield experience. Finally, James spotted the target, a large, half-intact house at the village center, guarded by just enough men to suggest arrogance rather than caution. This was the moment when planning met opportunity, when skill had to overcome fear. He adjusted his pack, checked the rifle, and whispered a silent vow to himself. Failure was not an option. The impossible was only as impossible as those who feared to try. As he descended from the wall, shadows shifting beneath the rain-soaked rooftops. The first faint stirrings of the officer's presence reached him. The sound of boots on wooden floors, distant laughter, the calculated rhythm of a man who thought himself untouchable. And in that moment, James knew the real challenge was about to begin. James crouched in the shadow of the ruined wall, rain dripping steadily from his helmet onto his mud-streaked face. Before him stood the officer's residence, a two-story building, scarred by artillery, its windows shattered but guarded with deliberate care. He watched the enemy soldiers move like clockwork, confident, efficient, almost arrogant in their routines. Every conventional approach he had trained for seemed doomed to failure. A frontal assault would be suicide? An overt ambush would alert the officer and risk the lives of countless Allied troops counting on the mission's success. He wiped a hand across his brow and muttered under his breath, "There's no easy way." That was when it struck him. The impossible wasn't about fighting smarter, it was about thinking differently. A plan began to form, risky and unconventional, a maneuver that relied on deception, patience, and nerves of steel. If executed correctly, it could place him inside the building undetected and give him the chance to capture the officer alive. But one mistake, one hesitation, and he would be caught, perhaps tortured, and certainly killed. James ran the steps through his mind again and again. First, he would create a diversion at the rear entrance using a makeshift explosive. Not enough to destroy, just enough to draw attention. As the guards rushed to investigate, he would slip through a hidden side passage he had noticed earlier, half collapsed, narrow, and unguarded. From there, he could ascend to the upper floors where intelligence suggested the officer conducted. His planning, the maneuver, was audacious. Audacious was one thing, impossible was another. Yet audacity was all he had. He crouched lower, letting the rain wash away the sweat on his temples. Doubt crept in, gnawing at his resolve. What if I fail? What if the officer anticipates this? What if I... The thoughts were suffocating, but he forced them aside. His hands tightened around the rifle, his mind sharpened. Every second of hesitation could be fatal. Every life depending on this mission hung in a fragile balance, and he could not allow fear to govern his actions. "Think," he whispered to himself, "one move at a time, one breath, one step. Survive long enough to see it through." He glanced at the mud-soaked streets below. The officer's men moved in patterns that were predictable yet deadly, one guard pausing longer at the entrance, another pacing with unnerving precision, their eyes scanning every shadow. James knew he would have to mimic their movements, anticipate their attention, and exploit the gaps between patrols. He recalled the lessons from his training: patience, observation, and deception. Tonight they would be the difference between life and death. He dug into his pack and retrieved a small satchel of explosives and a bundle of wires he had assembled earlier. Carefully he tested the fuse, ensuring it would create just enough noise to divert the patrols without raising suspicion of anything more dangerous. Every detail mattered: the sound, the timing, the placement. Miscalculate, and the officer would vanish, or worse, retaliate. For a long moment, James allowed himself a thought that he barely admitted aloud: I might not make it out alive. But with that fear came a steely resolve. He had prepared for this, studied every report, every sketch, every piece of intelligence. This was the culmination of months of planning and observation. This was why he was here, alone, in the belly of enemy territory, performing what every other soldier had deemed impossible. He thought of the Allied forces relying on the capture of this officer. The lives already lost, there countless more at risk. The responsibility weighed on him like an anchor, yet also fueled him. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. And James, trembling, wet, exhausted, knew he had courage in abundance. A soft rustle behind him made him freeze. A shadow flitted across the alley, just a stray cat, or perhaps something more. He exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his muscles. There was no room for doubt now. Every movement, every decision had to be precise. James crouched and surveyed the building again, committing every detail to memory. The gaps between patrols, the half-collapsed stairwell, the room where the officer likely stood reviewing maps. He could visualize the maneuver from start to finish, each step timed with meticulous care. This wasn't luck. This wasn't improvisation. This was strategy, and he was about to test it under fire. A distant shout of a German patrol reminded him that time was running short. The diversion had to happen soon. He adjusted the pack on his back, checking the placement of explosives one last time. His fingers brushed the wires, damp from rain, yet steady with resolve. One false move could ignite them prematurely. One hesitation could blow the mission wide open, and yet, beneath the tension, a spark of exhilaration surged through him. This was the edge of the impossible, the razor-thin line between life and death where heroes were born. With careful breath and steady hands, James set the fuse, positioned the satchel near the rear entrance, and backed into the shadows, ready to execute the maneuver that no one else dared even imagine. The night held its breath. Somewhere inside the house, the enemy officer moved, unaware that the impossible was about to arrive at his doorstep. And as James prepared to step from shadow to action, a single thought crystallized in his mind. Victory would demand more than skill. It would demand audacity, cunning, and the courage to defy the impossible. The night had grown colder. The rain now a relentless curtain against the ruins of the village. James crouched behind a broken wall, the fuse of the makeshift diversion ticking quietly in his mind. Every nerve was taut. Every breath a conscious effort not to betray his presence. He could hear the distant murmur of enemy voices, the soft scrape of boots on wet cobblestones, and the whisper of the wind threading through shattered windows. Each sound was a puzzle he had to decode to survive. The diversion had worked. A muted explosion from the rear entrance drew the guards away, like moths to a flame. James watched from the shadows, noting how they scrambled, shouting commands, rifles clattering against walls. One of them paused to kick at a broken door frame, swearing under his breath, while another waved others toward the noise. Timing was everything. He slipped into the narrow side passage he had observed earlier, the wood slick beneath his hands. A single misstep would have alerted anyone in the courtyard, and James knew it. The passage narrowed sharply, forcing him to move almost on his stomach. Water pooled at the bottom, seeping into his uniform and chilling him to the bone. His mind raced with calculations, the officer's position, the location of guards, the likely pattern of patrols returning. He forced himself to focus on the rhythm of his movements, the precise placement of his hands and feet. Every muscle coiled with deliberate intent. A creak echoed above him. His heart slammed against his ribs. He froze, every sense alert. Somewhere upstairs, the officer or one of his aides was pacing. James could hear the soft thud of boots on wooden floors, each step a reminder that failure would be instant and fatal. He held his breath, waiting for the sound to pass, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. Then he moved again, slower now, almost gliding across the wet floorboards. Reaching the top of the stairwell, James peeked through a shattered doorway. There he was, the officer, standing over a table cluttered with maps and reports, illuminated by a single flickering lamp. Every detail of his posture, every twitch of his hand was etched into James's memory. This was the man who had orchestrated ambush, who had outmaneuvered entire battalions. And tonight he was within reach. James exhaled quietly, steadying his hands on the rifle. He had anticipated this moment for hours, yet the reality was sharper, more dangerous than any rehearsal. One false move, one whispered step, and the officer would vanish into a stairwell or behind guards. He adjusted his grip and inched forward, mindful of the shadows. The smell of wet wood and burning oil filled his nostrils, and he could feel the officer's presence like a heat radiating from across the room. A sudden scrape of a boot on debris sent James's pulse spiking. He flattened against the wall, rifle raised, body pressed low. A guard passed the doorway, unaware, then moved on. The seconds felt like hours, each one an eternity where a single twitch could undo everything. He reminded himself, patience now. Action in the precise moment. Creeping forward, James reached the edge of the officer's room. The faint glow of the lamp cast long shadows, hiding him just enough. His plan was simple in theory, but perilous in execution. Distract, disarm, and secure the officer before reinforcements could respond. His mind ran through contingencies. What if the officer resisted? What if the door creaked under pressure? What if the guard returned prematurely? Every possibility had a counter. Every risk had a calculated response. The officer moved closer to a cabinet, bending down to retrieve a folder. James saw his opportunity. He advanced silently, heart hammering, every sense alert. The officer's back was to him. The room was otherwise empty. He raised the rifle, ready not to fire, but to use it as leverage, to subdue and take control. The tension was unbearable, breath caught, muscles taut like steel wires. Then, a whisper behind him, a rat, scuttling across broken wood, made him freeze mid-motion. His pulse throbbed in his temples. Seconds stretched into an eternity as the officer remained unaware, still bent over the folder. James's hands shook slightly, but he forced control, recalling every drill, every lesson in stealth and patience. One wrong move and all would be lost. He lunged forward with precise timing, using the rifle to knock the officer off balance, shoving him against the wall. The officer spun, eyes wide in shock, and for a moment the room seemed suspended in chaos. James moved faster than thought, securing the officer's arms and pressing him to the ground. The maps and folders scattered with a dull thud, but the officer's struggle was brief. James's calculated strength and speed had given him the upper hand. Outside, the shouts of the returning patrols grew louder. The officer cursed, panic flashing across his face, realizing his situation. James whispered, "Quiet, or we're both dead," pressing a hand over the officer's mouth. The impossible maneuver had succeeded, but the danger was far from over. Every second counted as reinforcements closed in. Alerted by the distant noises of the diversion, James quickly secured the officer with handcuffs and assessed the room. He glanced at the maps scattered across the table, realizing the magnitude of what they contained. Intelligence that could save hundreds of lives was now within reach. Yet his focus remained razor-sharp on the task at hand: escape. The tension in the village was a living thing, breathing down his neck. But the critical first step, a capture, was complete. As he prepared to move, the officer's eyes met his, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and grudging respect. In that brief glance, James felt the weight of the mission, the burden of responsibility, and the stark reality of survival. He had achieved the impossible, but only halfway. Now every step, every move, would determine if they both made it out alive. The officer's resistance was brief but fierce. James had anticipated panic, but the sheer force of instinct and fear made the man struggle with unexpected strength. Rainwater from the broken window dripped onto the floor, mingling with the scattered papers, a steady rhythm beneath the chaos. James pressed the officer against the wall, his hands gripping tight, every muscle coiled like a spring. The rifle had served its purpose as leverage. Now it was speed, strategy, and raw nerve that would secure the final step. "You're coming with me," James whispered, voice low but unwavering. The officer's eyes flicked from rage to confusion, scanning the darkened room, realizing the extent of his vulnerability. Outside, the patrols were returning, their shouts distant but growing louder, like the tide closing in. There was no room for hesitation. Every moment counted. James forced the officer to the floor, rolling him into a shadowed corner where the darkness could conceal them. He worked quickly, pulling handcuffs from his pack. The cold metal clicked into place around the officer's wrists, the sound impossibly loud in the otherwise still room. For a heartbeat, James paused, catching his breath, allowing the weight of what he had done to wash over him. One man, strategically outmaneuvered, had the power to change the fate of countless lives. The officer spat, cursing, attempting to twist free. James pressed down with careful but firm authority. "Every step you take from here matters," he said, not just as a threat, but as a reminder to himself that control had to be maintained until they were safely beyond enemy reach. Fear, adrenaline, and relief coursed through his veins all at once. The impossible had been achieved, but only the first phase. He glanced around the room, noting exits, weak points, and obstacles. The door was too exposed, the stairwell too. Open, James's mind raced, replaying every plan, every improvisation he had memorized. The officer's men were returning, the distant pounding of boots echoing like the drumbeat of an approaching storm. James had no choice but to move, to lead the officer through a perilous path he had calculated earlier. One misstep, one unexpected. Patrol and the entire mission could collapse. Moving low and fast, James guided the officer toward a narrow side exit. Each step was deliberate, every sound minimized. The officer tried to bolt once, but James's grip was unyielding, reinforced with the weight of purpose and desperation. "Not tonight," he whispered, adrenaline sharpening every sense. Outside, the chaos of the diversion still lingered, a small window through which he could slip unnoticed. As they reached the alley, a glimmer of moonlight revealed the waterlogged streets, slick and treacherous. James balanced the officer's weight while navigating debris, each footfall a careful negotiation between speed and stealth. The officer's curses filled the air, but James ignored them, focusing solely on survival and completing the mission. His heart raced, but his mind remained razor-sharp. Every calculated risk, every precise movement, had brought them to this moment. A sudden flash of movement, a returning patrol made James freeze, instinct seizing control. He pressed the officer against a wall, pulling him into the shadow just as the guard's flashlights swept past. The officer's eyes widened with panic, and James held him still, silent, muscles taut, waiting until the danger passed. Relief surged through him once they had moved beyond the immediate threat, though the pulse of fear remained, a constant reminder that this was far from over. Finally they reached the canal edge, a narrow plank slick with rain. James's boots slipped slightly, sending a jolt of panic through him, but he adjusted, using the officer's momentum to stabilize their movement. Every step was a careful balance between agility and caution. He had trained for scenarios like this, but nothing could replicate the real pulse of danger, the intoxicating mixture of fear and focus that surged with each footfall. When they reached a hidden landing beyond the immediate patrols, James allowed himself a moment to breathe. The officer slumped, exhaustion and disbelief etched across his face. James could feel his own body trembling, every nerve, every fiber charged with the aftermath of near death, adrenaline and the weight of responsibility. He glanced at the scattered maps clinging to the wet floor, realizing that the intelligence they now held could turn the tide of the campaign. And yet, amidst the relief, James felt the moral weight of what had just occurred. This was a mana. Strategist, a soldier, a human being captured at gunpoint. James had not taken his life, but he had disrupted it, reshaped it in an instant, and forced him into submission. War demanded harsh decisions, and tonight, the line between survival and morality blurred like shadows across the rain-slick streets. The officer's eyes met his, wide with fear and disbelief. For a fleeting moment, James saw something more than anger recognition. He had been outmaneuvered. The impossible had been done. The impossible had been made real. The officer would be removed from the battlefield, and countless lives would be spared because one soldier had dared to act where others had feared. James adjusted the handcuffs, checking the rifle, and scanned the surrounding rooftops. There was no time for celebration. The mission was only half complete. Escape remained, and danger lingered in every shadow. But for this moment, he allowed himself a quiet, internal acknowledgement of victory. The impossible had been achieved. As the distant shouts of the enemy patrols faded into the night, James led the officer toward the next phase of the mission. Each step weighted with the knowledge of what had been accomplished, and the knowledge that the night was far from over. He had captured a key enemy officer against all odds, and the battlefield would never be the same again. The rain had eased into a persistent drizzle, but the village streets remained slick and treacherous. James led the officer through shadowed alleys, every sense stretched to its limit. He could hear the distant clatter of returning patrols, the occasional bark of a dog, and the faint rush of water in the canal. Each sound reminded him that danger had not disappeared, it had simply shifted. The officer, now handcuffed and subdued, trailed reluctantly behind. His eyes darted constantly, calculating, trying to find an opening to resist. James kept his rifle angled between them, every movement precise. "Quiet," he muttered, voice low but firm. The officer's scowl deepened, but he obeyed. For now, the streets seemed endless, broken buildings creating a maze that would have disoriented anyone. Unprepared, James's boots slipped on rain-soaked cobblestones, the mud sucking at each step, threatening to pull him down. He adjusted his pace, mindful of the officer's weight and the precarious balance of speed and stealth. One misstep could reveal their position to the patrolling enemy, and one discovery could unravel everything. Every shadow was a potential threat. He paused behind a collapsed wall as two German soldiers passed, rifles ready, their conversation carried by the wind. The officer tensed behind him, muscles coiled for action. James felt a flicker of guilt. He had put this man in his hands. And yet survival depended on control, on dominance. The officer's reputation as a ruthless tactician had been earned, and now it was his resource as much as his captive. James led them toward a narrow canal that cut through the outskirts of the village. The water, swollen from rain, roared softly against crumbling stone. Planks and debris formed unstable bridges across it. One slip could mean falling into the icy current, exposure to enemy patrols, or worse. He tested each plank before placing. The officers weighed on it, silently counting steps. Every move demanded patience and nerve. As they neared the far bank, a sudden shout echoed from behind. A returning patrol had noticed the diversion earlier and was closing in faster than expected. James's pulse spiked. He pressed the officer against the wall, whispering, "Stay down. Stay quiet." The officer's eyes widened with fear, and James realized the man's survival now depended entirely on him. The patrol passed too close for comfort, the sound of boots hammering the cobblestones like a drumbeat of doom. James held his breath, muscles taut, listening to every echo, every ripple of water. Once the danger passed, he continued, urgency tempered by calculated caution. Each step was a negotiation between speed and stealth, between adrenaline and awareness. For a moment, he allowed himself a brief glance at the officer. Exhaustion and disbelief were etched across his face, but so was grudging recognition. James realized the human cost of war. This man, once an enemy mastermind, was now in his hands, vulnerable and exposed. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him heavier than any pack. Victory was not just strategy or skill. It was the courage to carry the burden afterward. The landscape shifted as they moved further from the village. Mud gave way to uneven forest paths, roots slick with rain, branches clawing at their uniforms. Every step carried new dangers, from hidden holes to the possibility of stumbling into enemy scouts. James's mind was a constant map, plotting routes, calculating distances, anticipating patrol patterns. The officer followed silently, the handcuffs a stark reminder of the delicate balance between control and chaos. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the soft patter of rain and the occasional whisper of movement ahead. James felt fatigue clawing at his limbs, muscles screaming, but he pushed forward. Lives depended on this, and failure was not an option. He thought of his unit, of the soldiers who would benefit from the intelligence now secured. He thought of the men he had lost in previous skirmishes and the price they had paid. Each step was a tribute to them, each careful maneuver a defiance of the odds. Finally, a faint glimmer of light appeared through the trees, the glow of Allied positions waiting beyond the forest edge. Relief surged through him, but caution remained. Enemy patrols could still be lurking, ready to reclaim their officer. James adjusted his grip on the rifle, ready for a final sprint if necessary. The officer stumbled slightly, fatigue and fear slowing him. James steadied him, muttering, "Almost there. Don't falter now." As they broke through the final line of shadows and entered the faintly lit Allied perimeter, James allowed himself the briefest exhale. The officer's hands were still bound, but the tension in the air eased just enough to recognize accomplishment. The mission had succeeded, against every expectation, against the impossible. Yet James felt no triumph in the traditional sense only. The quiet, sober relief of survival and duty fulfilled. The officer was taken into Allied custody, and James stepped back, watching him vanish into the secured area. The rain continued to fall, washing away the grime of battle and fear, leaving behind a strange clarity. The mission had been more than daring. It had been a test of nerve, intelligence, and human endurance. And as James removed his helmet and let the cold drizzle run down his face, he understood that courage was measured not in victories, but in the choices one made when every option carried risk. The impossible maneuver had been completed, but its cost and consequence lingered. For James, survival was intertwined with responsibility, and every step from here forward would be haunted by the knowledge of what had been risked. And What had been saved. Dawn broke over the Allied camp, mist curling along the riverbanks and the charred remnants of the village still visible in the distance. James sat on a log, boots muddy, uniform soaked, and hands still trembling from the night's ordeal. The officer, now securely in custody, had been escorted to headquarters, where intelligence officers would begin the painstaking process of extracting the information that could save countless lives. James allowed himself a moment of quiet, the weight of everything he had done pressing down with the gravity of history itself. The documents retrieved from the officer revealed plans for ambush, troop movements, and supply lines information that could prevent devastating losses and turn the tide in upcoming engagements. Commanders pored over maps, issuing counter orders, and within hours, what had seemed an impossible mission had begun to reshape the battlefield. One soldier, acting alone, had changed the course of events in a way few could ever fully comprehend. James leaned back, staring at the pale sky, and reflected on the night's events. Fear, adrenaline, and doubt had been constant companions, yet they had not broken him. He had taken calculated risks, balanced courage with caution, and acted when hesitation would have meant failure. It was not glory he felt. There was no cheering crowds, no medals pinned to his chest, but something quieter, more profound, the knowledge that he had done what was necessary, and that countless lives were safer because of it. He remembered the officer's eyes during their capture, the mixture of rage, disbelief, and reluctant acknowledgement. That single glance encapsulated the human side of war, the collision of strategy, morality, and survival. Even in victory, James felt the somber truth of what war demanded, the price exacted from both the vanquished and the victor. Courage was not glamorous. It was measured in quiet acts of resolve, in decisions made under unbearable pressure, in the willingness to shoulder responsibility when the world seemed impossibly vast and dangerous. A fellow soldier approached, offering a nod of respect. "Heard what you did last night," the man said quietly. "No one thought it could be done." James nodded, not in pride but in understanding. Recognition was fleeting in war. The mission had been larger than personal acclaim. Still, the acknowledgement grounded him, reminding him that even singular acts of bravery ripple outward, influencing the lives of many. As James walked toward the command tent to report, he passed the perimeter where soldiers were already preparing for the next engagement. The knowledge gained from the captured officer would fortify defenses, anticipate enemy movements, and save lives in battles yet to come. One night, one maneuver, one decision had created a chain reaction, proof that courage, intellect, and determination could tip the scales even in the chaos of war. He paused at the edge of the camp, looking back toward the village that had been both battlefield and proving ground. Smoke still rose faintly from ruins. The mud glistened in the first light. James exhaled slowly, allowing the tension of the night to seep away. The impossible had been accomplished, but the cost remained clear: exhaustion, fear, and the ever-present reminder that lives had been at stake with every choice. Quiet heroism, he realized, was often invisible to the world. There would be no grand ceremony, no parade in his honor. Yet he had changed history in his own small, profound way. The officer was captured, intelligence secured, lives saved, and a critical mission completed against staggering odds. It was enough. It had to be. As the sun rose higher, James stood, adjusted his pack, and prepared to move forward with his unit. The rain had washed the streets clean, but the memory of that impossible night would remain, etched forever in his mind, a reminder of courage, resilience, and the quiet power of a single soldier willing to act when all others hesitated. And in that moment, amidst the soft dawn light, James understood that sometimes the smallest acts, performed with precision and courage, were capable of changing the course of war and the lives of countless souls forever.